Maybe that's it. I think it's maybe a more of a, kind of the chamber of commerce of bad intention. Maybe that's the way to look at it. When you think about people's general self-interest and how they align them, it's and now with information, the advent of so much information, how easy is it to push all that along? And like here in the U.S., the last elections, I mean in Alaska, where I live, where there's just a few 100,000 voters on the U.S. Senate race, $60 million got spent, which is an enormous sum of money when you stop and think about it. And most of it from people who don't even live here, I mean, in terms of being resident in this place and trying to influence its outcomes and doing it. Uh, when you think about moneyed interest in government as an example, wow, what an influence. Try and go see your congressman or U.S. senator as an average citizen. You might get a 30-second, a minute photo op and in and out. But if you lay out a $5,000 or $10,000 campaign contribution, I guarantee you'll get a conversation, maybe even lunch. You know, and the sad part of that is it's institutionalized. In other countries where they call that bribery, here we call it a campaign contribution. You know what I mean? But it really kind of results in the same thing, right? Influence, access, outcomes. I
It,
mean,
it,
this.
it's what was it? Bill Hicks was one time reading this porno magazine, and it has this disclaimers that said all of our models are over 18, and he goes, "Oh, these are models!" All of a sudden,
Well, I guess it's all a matter of perspective, right? I mean, and maybe that's it. So when you think about all of that, I mean, think about moneyed interest in elections and what happens, the frustration people have with government right now. I don't care where you live. A lot of it's just driven by sort of the patchwork quilt of politics and public policy. It doesn't make a lot of sense because it just serves a bunch of special interest rather than serve a public purpose. And maybe that's what gets lost in some of this.
switching gears now, I'd like to change the topic to more exotic technologies, and I've been made aware that you're kind of familiar with the HARP program, but of course I have not done enough research to quantify. So if you'd explain briefly your involvement and perhaps your thoughts on the HARP machine, I'd be very much obliged.
Well, HARP was where a lot of the work I got involved with publicly started. It was a high frequency and is the high frequency active Aurora research project, which was originally an Air Force and Navy project here that eventually went to DARPA and now kind of gets funded intermittently by different agencies. But it was a developmental prototype that was designed to focus radio frequency energy in kind of a unique way to create a number of weapons effects here in Alaska. And as a result of sort of our reporting on that, we ended up reporting on a lot of areas of technology. This one was um, pretty interesting. It was developed originally by a guy named Dr. Bernard Eastland, who passed away in 2007. But he had invented a system, a phased array, a field of antennas that would focus radio frequency energy into the upper ionosphere or ionosphere above the Earth's surface, maybe 30 miles out or more, and affect that region and also affect the magnetic field lines that surround the Earth and create a number of weapons effects by just being able. I mean, think about the revolution of light when you think of lasers, in terms of how the different applications of lasers by focusing light energy into a relatively small or narrow beam. The idea of pushing or focusing radio frequency energy into a relatively small area as opposed to it spreading out, which is its natural tendency, the same as light. He figured out how to do that, how to create this focused energy that could then be manipulated for over the horizon radar, for weather manipulation, even for modulating the ionosphere, this energetic layer surrounding us, in such a way as to act as a broadcast antenna, sending signals back to the Earth and sea.
And exactly what kind of effects would you be able to have? I mean, are there multiple different kinds of effects or only just a number?
Sure. Like a couple different things, different ideas that came out of the research. The more interesting things like over the horizon radar, being able to bounce a signal over the horizon to pick up everything from, say, intercontinental ballistic missiles at really high elevations down to um, things like cruise missiles coming in very low. You could use it for that. You could modulate the jet stream in such a way as to cause it to move around a bit and create some changes in sort of weather patterns or anomalies in pretty distant places. You could do you could modulate a signal off of the ionosphere that could then penetrate the Earth and see for communication with submarines or for what was called and demonstrated to be Earth penetrating tomography. This is like, by analogy, would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep for underground facilities or mineral deposits or water, oil, natural gas, these kinds of things, minerals. You could do with this kind of imaging uh, um, by utilizing something like HARP. You could also manipulate the physiology of living organisms by manipulating energy in very specific ways, including human beings. So when you think about radio frequency and the idea of manipulating it for different purposes, HARP became sort of a development, was and is a developmental prototype for exploring some of these concepts.
Could we backtrack a little and talk about some of the possible effects that you could do on humans?
Yeah, if you go back, in fact, if you go back even further, go back to J.F. Gordon MacDonald. There was a book written by Zbigniew Brzezinski when he was at Columbia University, and he quotes this guy. And MacDonald was a geophysicist, and he was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson when he was president of the United States on science. And at UCLA, he was writing back in the 60s. In 69, he published a chapter called "How to Wreck Your Environment" in a book at the time. And in this, he talked about the idea of if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of people within that signal range. And what he was referring to or alluding to is the idea of creating a frequency following response, or an FFR, where the brain will lock onto an external signal within certain window frequencies and begin to mirror it or become entrained or lock into that signal in such a way that your general emotional state over large areas of probably 70, maybe even as many as 80% of the population might be affected in this way, where you essentially can change the emotional state of large segments of the population, as an example.
Could it be used to make people, I don't know, dumb, stupid, or something? Because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's.
Well, let's say this. You could generate fear like what you saw in the first war in Iraq. If you remember the levels of fear that were generated in one of the systems that were used back then, that was reported in Scottish media, was something very similar, where they actually piggybacked a signal on the radio broadcasts going into the region, the ones broadcasting Muslim music and prayers and so on. And what they would do is piggyback a signal that would generate this underlying sense of stress or anxiety. And the result of that was it just amplified the effect of the bombardment and the war and caused that system to collapse pretty rapidly. If you think about the fourth largest army in the world in that first conflict, how fast that was concluded.
Are there limits to its effect? It can influence people. Can it control them?
Well, I don't know how far it's really gone. We report on what's been published. There was some interesting developments in terms of how far it goes. There was 2 DARPA contracts that were led a couple of years ago to the University of California on the concept of, for instance, electronic telepathy, the idea of being able to look at brain activity with an individual and be able to look at the complex signals coming from that, and then being able to read or analyze those signals into some kind of output, so you literally knew what a person was thinking, and then taking it the next step and being able to replicate that signal, that complex signal, and send it into another brain to see if you could literally transfer thoughts. I mean, that's where the research right now is headed. In between that and where it's gone, say since the 50s, when our government first started at least getting pretty heavily engaged in this. And it goes even further back to the researches at Harvard University in the 1920s and 30s, when the first hypnotherapy labs were being established.
And in your experience researching into these fields, does the military discover things and not announce them until long after they've got them in working order and production and even in use?
Oh, generally speaking, I would say that's right. Or at least you see some, you kind of see the early stages of this in the RFPs, the request for proposals, what the government goes out and looks for within its funding that it at least opens to the public, basic research initiatives, these kinds of things. And you see, some of that gives you at least directionally where it's headed. How far it's gone, you never really see that until usually decades after. I mean, a lot of the things in the, for instance, in the mind control research goes back to the 50s and 60s and into the 70s from the church committee hearings in the early 70s. And a lot of that is what continues to be quoted to this day. And little bits and pieces, eventually make their way out under various Freedom of Information Act requests, and people connect the dots little by little, but usually decades later after the research was long concluded.
So just to be safe, assume that it's a lot worse than you could ever imagine.
That's probably a safe bet. In terms of how especially in the areas of privacy, if people think that they have any personal privacy, it's naive. In the 21st century, you have none. The presumption of personal privacy should be zero. So start with that, because that's really the state of the technology in that area. Now, when you start to go beyond that, walking through airports, looking at personalities, just facial expressions, with about 65, 70% accuracy, you can pick out all kinds of stressors that maybe narrow the population of who you want to look at. When you start to think about facial recognition and other systems that are increasingly more sophisticated and more efficient, privacy is really a lost thing, the way information is regulated and stored and managed.
I saw an interesting article not some time ago that said that facial recognition systems don't work if you're black.
Oh, that's interesting. Whether that's true or not, I would wonder about that a bit, just because of the sophistication of systems. When you think again of resolution, at one point in time we said, oh, you can't broadcast energy wirelessly for more than a few millimeters, and then it was meters, and then it was kilometers. And when you think about technology again, it's like doubling from the invention of the wheel to where we are today about every 6 or 7 months. I mean, imagine what the capabilities are. I mean, a couple big areas that make huge leaps in where we are. Quantum computing versus supercomputing. Supercomputing, take everybody on the planet with a hand calculator for about 60 hours making a calculation every few seconds, and you still get to a supercomputer's second of computing, right? But take a supercomputer for an hour and compare it to a quantum computer. And the difference is an hour, a trillion years of supercomputer equals an hour of quantum computer. When we make that next leap, which is some say we've already made it, it means that all encryption systems become obsolete. Your ability to do predictive models is never perfect, but it gets really close. And we rely then on these computers more and more, and yet they don't quite get it right.
Well, I was just thinking about that in terms of all the
In other countries, where they call that bribery, here we call it a campaign contribution. You know what I mean? But it really kind of results in the same thing, right? Influence, access, outcomes. I
It,
mean,
it,
this.
it's what was it? Bill Hicks was one time reading this porno magazine, and it has this disclaimers that said all of our models are over 18, and he goes, "Oh, these are models!" All of a sudden.
Well, I guess it's all a matter of perspective, right? And maybe that's it. So when you think about all of that, think about moneyed interest in elections and what happens, the frustration people have with government right now. I don't care where you live. A lot of it's just driven by sort of the patchwork quilt of politics and public policy. It doesn't make a lot of sense because it just serves a bunch of special interest rather than serve a public purpose. And maybe that's it. I think it's maybe a more of a, kind of the chamber of commerce of bad intention. Maybe that's the way to look at it. When you think about people's general self-interest and how they align them, it's and now with information, the advent of so much information, how easy is it to push all that along? And like here in the U.S., the last elections, an example. Wow, what an influence. Try and go see your congressman or U.S. senator as an average citizen. You might get a 30-second, a minute photo op and in and out, But if you lay out a $5,000 or $10,000 campaign contribution, I guarantee you'll get a conversation, maybe even lunch, And the sad part of that is it's institutionalized. In Alaska, where I live, where there's just a few 100,000 voters on the U.S. Senate race, $60 million got spent, which is an enormous sum of money when you stop and think about it. And most of it from people who don't even live here, in terms of being resident in this place and trying to influence its outcomes and doing it. When you think about moneyed interest in government as